Welcome to what I would call the most important and wonderful discipline in Australian education, English. And yes, I am biased. And why do I say that? Put simply, it forms the bedrock of civilization through communication. Because without successful communication, society would crumble.
English also teaches us about humanity. It teaches us empathy for others. How does it do that? Well, through reading other people's stories. And that, folk, is English. Whether it's poetry, a children's book, Sneetches, brilliant book, by the way. Whether it's a play, complicated play. Whether it's an autobiography. Whether it's a factual text, beginning teachers. Whether it's a magazine article, about a graphic novel. Another informative text with a particular perspective. What about a famous novel? Catching the Rye. What about texts like music? What about children's myths? And all that entails. What about picture books? And what about even children's pop-up books? All of these in the English classroom allow us to capture a snap of humanity, helps us make sense of our world. That's how we learn, through the exploration of others' texts, and that is English. And of course, let's not forget about the all very important grammar and meaning. And nor should we forget about social media. Which has some very powerful ways of influencing us. It's on the news, it's a constant source of frustration for parents. Educators debate it, discuss it all the time. This is what the English classroom is all about. Exploring perspectives in texts, analysing representations, and again, as I said, making sense of our world.
Okay, so we can't get any bigger than humanity, you think? Well, what makes up humanity? Language. What makes up language? Grammar, spelling, punctuation, inflection, words, which is vocabulary, and many other things. Which brings us to the nuts and bolts of communication, both written and spoken, understanding the way language works. So another big idea in the discipline, apart from humanity and making sense of our world, is exactly that, literacy. But it's not an easy place, not an easy space. It's regarded as being quite complex. Syntax, grammatical rules like subject-verb agreement and that sort of thing. But the consensus is that literacy needs to be taught. And then one would have to ask, but how? How are you going to go into the English classroom and teach literacy, to teach the grammar, to teach the punctuation? Another important question is, how do we use assessment to improve literacy rates? Our focus at the moment is assessment. What's our ultimate aim? To improve learning. How do we do that? Through assessment, particularly when it comes to literacy. Both the image in this slide and the one in the previous one are genuine images, photos that I have taken with my trusty camera as I traipse around city streets. What that signifies is that people care about literacy. Why? Because when people escape the jail of silence because they can't express themselves, They are actually empowered. I have many case studies and real stories that attest to this. Okay, so let's have a look at assessment principles. What we need to think about when we're devising assessment for English. What are the 4 things we need to seriously consider when it comes to devising the wording on our tasks? And what are authentic meaning-making activities for assessment? So, in English, there are 4 things that are absolutely critical. They are genre, audience, context, and purpose. And please forgive me for that missing comma between context and purpose. That is very unlike me, but it's 1 a.m. in the morning. So the tip for you very early in this course is to know those 4 things and the critical role that they play in helping students do well in their assessment, as well as devising correct assessment that covers every major component. So all 4 share an interconnectedness that cannot and should not be broken. We need to pay careful consideration to these when it comes time to design your assessment. In terms of meaningful, authentic, relevant, and purposeful assessment, that is not unique to English. But thought has to go into creating authentic assessments for our students to make it a worthwhile experience. As already stated, the following are really important. Let's talk about them. So the first one is genre. Is it a narrative, as indicated there? Is it a speech? Is it an essay? Does it need to have a thesis, or is it loaded with imagery, as it would be if it was a narrative? Now, this decision is important. It impacts upon everything else, just like those other 3 impact on it. So this interconnection is important to consider in terms of everything else that you devise for the task. So, for example, why is it so important? You wouldn't just ask students to write a persuasive speech simply because someone said so or because it's a good idea. It will actually be a conscious decision because it suits the purpose of the task. For example, it might be a call to action to mobilise a public campaign to undo the damage of social media, which is what everyone talks about all the time, by educating adolescents how to use it for their benefit, not for harm. Or it might be about persuading investors to fund a community project. Some schools are doing some really exciting things in this space. They're doing real project-based assessment where students interact with the community. One I know of, the students interview elderly residents at a nursing home and turn it into a feature article or an oral about generational differences. So, audience, also very important. Preferably not students' peers. That's a very ho-hum requirement. We can be a lot more imaginative than that. We want an authentic one. For example, if it's a church congregation, students can clearly see who they're trying to reach. And as such, they'd probably include some religious phrases and maybe even some Bible references. If it was a writers' festival, there'd be conviction about the power of language. One would imagine. It could be an entertainment forum or a rally or a show business event. It could be a parents' meeting at a community event, or it could be a parents' meeting one night after school. It could even be a series of local councillors or a group of journalists. And you can see how when we specify that audience, students know what sort of language they have to include. Makes it a lot more authentic. Let's have a look at context. So in terms of content, the context might be the environment, as is the case with these two images, which obviously incorporate opposing perspectives. The content could be social media. I've just given you an example earlier. Or it might be the relationship between older and younger generations. It's up to you to choose a context that is relevant to your students. In terms of context, you need to be mindful of the roles and relationships between the text creator and the text receiver. In this case, the student is a text creator. So, when we look at context, we look at these roles and relationships, and we have to have a reason why this particular context has been chosen. Remember the key words: meaningful, authentic, and purposeful. That is, it actually might be significant to your community. Let's hope so. Maybe in your community there's the social issue in the media is always there because the world is full of issues. But maybe in your particular community there's a high incidence of anxiety and adolescence caused by social media, or not. It might be something completely different. This is the opportunity for schools to choose something that is relevant or happening in the lives of their students. So students might adopt a role like a worried parent, or they might act as themselves, or they might act as a church minister. So again, that helps students understand what it is they're trying to do and how they need to behave. Let's now look at purpose. Is it to inform or educate? Is it to persuade? Maybe it's to encourage a particular group of people to take action. Maybe it's to make a difference. Or simply, it might be to entertain. As already stated though, these are critical components of writing assessments in the discipline of English. What is always of interest when it comes to education are the debates that go on and on and on, and some subjects are more susceptible to it or exposed to it than others. English is one of those. Everyone feels very passionately about it, and as a result, there are lots of debates in the community. One of them is about standardized testing and whether it's actually a good thing, beneficial, or harmful. Now, this is obviously not unique to English, but rarely does a day go by when you can turn on the radio or listen to the media and not hear someone talking about this. So it does receive a lot of attention, and NAPLAN is obviously a standardized test. And it does receive a lot of attention and focus because of the literacy content, which of course is a major component of English. So English is nearly always in the news or in the media when it comes to standardized testing. But when we do think about it, what is the most important aspect of it? So standardized testing set parameters, good or bad, and what are the values to it? Obviously, standardized testing does enable a lot of analytics, and you can chart upward and downward trends. Now, when it comes to literacy, that debate about actually how to teach it is another issue. Should it be grammar in context or skills and drills? Or should it be both? Should it be a constructivist approach? That is, should it be child-centered, as we have there with the child in the arms of the adult? And inquiry-based? Or should it be direct instruction, rote learning? Or, alternatively, should it be both where appropriate? Again, NAPLAN draws a lot of passionate opinions, and I just wanted to read you something actually This is from a very highly regarded textbook about creativity in the English classroom. And the reason I wanted to read it to you is because it's very biased and it's using the genre of the narrative to manipulate the audience. Now, there are 3 little stories here. I'm only going to read a small portion of one of them, but I'll explain why there's bias in a moment. So it's a little story about a classroom, a child, a student, doing NAPLAN. Abdel looks back at the bubbles on the paper in front of him. So that's the NAPLAN test. He picks up his pencil. He digs the lead of the pencil into the paper, gripping the sides of it. His head is foggy. The words on the paper seem to swirl on the page and then harden, indecipherable. The heater above on the brick wall seems to be directed straight at him. He puts his head on the desk. Lila starts shading lines on the side of the sand-coloured paper, the lines of a tree's branches spiralling outwards. She draws lines of branches falling from the tree on the side of the bubbles that she is supposed to be shading. Mr. Stewart is walking past her. He catches her eye and raises his eyebrows, shaking his head tight-lipped. Lila picks up her eraser and rubs out the lines on the side of the page. She breathes in deeply through her nose and then allows the air to slowly escape through her mouth. Now that's obviously quite a negative representation of NAPLAN and how it's affecting 2 students, male and female. It's also a classic case of manipulation. Where are the positive stories in this particular chapter? Well, there aren't any. So it's an incomplete representation. But that's where bias comes in, and that's where critical literacy comes in, and that's one of our focus areas for this wonderful subject. Okay, so as mentioned in the previous section, NAPLAN is a highly contested space and it's receiving a lot of tension and arousing a lot of passion and frustration and vigorous argument. So some have lauded it as a necessary requirement of any advanced country. We need to have a national standard that provides hard data on learning, that it's basically a must-have. And it's so essential to us as a nation because it's returned attention that is so necessary back to the nuts and bolts of language and how to use it. So that's one perspective. Necessary, really critical in terms of putting focus back on the function of language and how it creates meaning through punctuation, spelling and grammar. However, others have claimed the opposite. They actually have called it napalm, which is really quite derogatory. And the claims are that it's stressful for both students and teachers, and that school reporting of NAPLAN results has had terrible consequences for schools' reputations. So that's something to consider. Online testing, standardised testing, and what its place is in the English subject. Okay, so one final aspect to English in terms of debates that are current is about marking assessments and whether it should be done by a computer. Imagine that, marking an essay, not by human beings, but by a mathematical algorithm. So this is an interesting article from Independent Education. It's volume 28. And it's not very favourable or supportive of such an idea. Apparently, using algorithms to mark student work is actually more accurate than a human brain, and that it has been stunningly successful. But people who are concerned about it are worried about the nuances in writing not being able to be understood by these algorithms. That's where the uniqueness of the human brain perhaps comes into play. So that's a debate in this discipline area at the moment as well. And there is another one. There's a little bit of tension about genre-based approaches. One perspective is that imposing a highly formulaic approach to the teaching of writing, in particular genres, is valid. I've already talked about genres. I've talked about speeches, narratives, essays, that sort of thing. And they do provide a lot of support and scaffolding and comfort and security for students because they give students a structure in which to order their ideas, and that has to have merit. But some people think that that squashes creativity. And some very highly regarded scholars are saying this. I guess I don't really want to say too much about that, just to raise your awareness of it, but to show you this amazing, wonderful hybrid of genres which was recently done by the New York Times. It's called Snowfall, the Avalanche at Tunnel Creek. All you need to do is find it, is Google it. New York Times, Snowfall, the Avalanche at Tunnel Creek, and it will come up. And I tell you what, it is a wonderful experience. It really changes a relationship between the text creator and the audience. It really becomes a three-dimensional experience. And you'll clearly see what can be done when genres are combined in an appropriate way in a digital environment. It really is something that every English teacher should be aware of, because who knows, this might be where the classroom assessments of the future lie. Definitely worth thinking about. And finally, finishing off, English will always be in the public eye because, as said at the beginning of this video, it matters. Everyone has an opinion of humanity, society, and the interconnections between them through the use of language, and of course, thus through literacy. Because of this, some teachers or people view it as a prison, besieged by idealists and pragmatists constantly bickering about its multifaceted nature, both outside it and within it. This, more than ever, makes assessment in this discipline area also more important than ever.